So let's talk about the difference between vulnerabilities and exposures and exploits. Vulnerabilities and exposures are really just areas where you may have weakness within a system or a network. So that would be a vulnerability. And if you've got a vulnerability, you have some exposure because of that vulnerability. When you've got a vulnerability, if somebody were to trigger that vulnerability and say, get into your system, that would be an exploit. Vulnerabilities don't always necessarily have exploits. Sometimes you may have a vulnerability that is more theoretical than it is anything else. You could have something that technically is a vulnerability. So, for example, you may have a sequence of events that has to happen in a very particular order, and the timing has to be just right. So, technically, it's a vulnerability because it could get triggered. The level of difficulty to trigger a vulnerability may be really hard. So, just because you've got a vulnerability doesn't necessarily mean that there is an exploit. This database here is hosted by MITRE, and you can go to cve.mitre.org. That's MITRE, not MITER. If you go to cve.mitre.org, you will get to this place, and you've got the ability to look at the entire list of CVEs, so all existing CVEs. You could search for a particular CVE. So let's just say we want to look for vulnerabilities within Apache, and you've got a list of all of the vulnerabilities. If you happen to find a vulnerability, you could request a CVE ID and you would get one of these CVE numbers. So let's just take a look at this, for example. This happens to be an issue that was discovered in Pivotal Springs security. So this happens to relate to Apache. This is not something that is specifically in the Apache web server. There is a difference between vulnerabilities and exposures and exploits. If you go to the CVE database website here at cve.mitre.org, you're going to be able to search through those. And we're going to be looking at scanning vulnerabilities. And I just want to make sure that you understand the difference between vulnerabilities and exploits. They are not the same thing. There is a difference between a vulnerability and an exploit.